Hey, this is Gray Crawford, and I'm here to talk about the full moon in Aquarius, bringing everything to a head on August 19th of 2024. This is probably the most powerful full moon of the entire year. Now, it's not a eclipse or a lunar eclipse, but this full moon is setting off an extremely powerful configuration that signals we are at a major crossroads, an extraordinary turning point of this year. And really, in a bigger picture, this is a turning point into the rest of the decade. And this is a very extreme decade that we have ahead. There are incredible astrological configurations that I'm sure you've heard many astrologers already talking about, telling you what is going to happen. Many astrologers making very confident predictions about what's going to happen. And one thing I would just say about all of that is just to be careful when people are telling you that they know certain events in the world are going to be happening in the years ahead. There are a lot of predictions and trends that we can look at based upon past astrological cycles. And there certainly are some things that we can talk about that could emerge in great likelihood based upon different past patterns, giving you a sort of sense of archetypal possibilities of what could very much occur in the world. But the astrology configurations coming in the years ahead are pretty extraordinary, and they're not anything any of us have seen in our lifetimes. And so there is something that's also somewhat unpredictable about what's going to be happening in the years ahead. Even though it might seem certain things are likely to happen right now based upon world events and where things are going, things can really change because so much is going to be changing in the next year. Between now and next year, all of the planets will be changing signs. Pluto's in Aquarius right now. It's going to go back to Capricorn. It will later go back into Aquarius for good. Jupiter's in Gemini right now. It'll be moving into Cancer. Saturn's in Pisces right now. It'll be moving into Aries. Neptune's in Pisces right now. It'll be moving into Aries. And next July, the last piece in all of these planets is Uranus, and it will move from Taurus into Gemini. To say this is a extraordinary, huge shift is really, honestly, an understatement. And what's so important about this full moon in Aquarius is I feel this is really our entryway into this portal of accelerated change that is not going to really let up for many years. And so one issue I just have with a lot of the astrologers making clickbaits and saying this is like the worst astrology of the year and making really dramatic faces to get you to click on it is just that the astrology is going to continue to be intense. And so, really, what we need to do right now is focus on what we can control, the areas of life we can really make an impact, our relationships and loved ones and greater community who we can stand up for, protect, encourage, inspire, and most of all, get inspired about your life. And most of all, figure out what it is that you really want to create and participate in these years ahead. These are years that are going to bring dramatic change. And so the reason this full moon in Aquarius is so important is because it is setting off at the exact same time as the full moon, the opening waxing square between Jupiter and Saturn. This Jupiter Saturn cycle goes back to the end of 2020 when Jupiter and Saturn formed a conjunction in the first degree of Aquarius. This was a huge, great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn that not only initiated a new 20-year cycle between them, but a 200-year cycle of Jupiter and Saturn only forming conjunctions in air signs. This goes with all the great change happening in the world. Air signs bring even more change than normal, just because air is so circulative, quickly moving, dispersing what's been set up before. The real solid forms that had and foundations that had really been built over many, many years during that Earth era of Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions are now starting to blow, shift, mutate. And that's going to continue to happen. It will be a chaotic time in world events. And so, what's so important about right now in the crossroads we are at is to center and to use this week that involves Mercury retrograde. It involves Mars and Jupiter coming together. It involves Mars clashing in a square aspect with Saturn. It involves Mars clashing in a square aspect with Venus, Venus forming a square to both Mars and Jupiter, as well as Venus forming a very tense opposition with Saturn. All of this forming, all of this coming together at the same time, this full moon is going to illuminate and really set it all off in very dramatic fashion. But this can really be a gift in many ways, especially the fact that this is happening in mutable signs. Now, the full moon is in a fixed sign of Aquarius, so this does indicate there are some long-term plans and trajectory of events that are really being illuminated at this time. But the fact that Saturn, Mars, Jupiter, and Venus are all in mutable signs, forming a mutable T square, creating this mutable crossroads, I feel is extremely helpful in terms of adaptation, flexibility, realizing where we need to change, what needs to let go, what needs to be brought to an end, where do we put new energy and initiative into the new cycles that are forming. It doesn't mean it's all going to be easy, but it also does not mean everything is going to go wrong. And in fact, there is a lot of substantial personal growth and development that can come through in this time period. So let's look into it a little bit more by looking at the charts. This is a chart of the full moon in Aquarius. And we can see that as this full moon is forming at the exact same time, we have Venus in Virgo opposing Saturn in Pisces, both of which are then forming square aspects with Mars and Jupiter in Gemini. At the same time, Mercury is retrograde in Leo and has just moved through its reanimating regenerative conjunction with the sun. So, this Mercury retrograde is extremely important because you can see that Venus is in a sign of Mercury, Mars and Jupiter are also in signs of Mercury. So, what I like about this in terms of Mercury retrograde helping is that at crossroads, we tend to think about perhaps a trickster showing up or some sort of threshold guardian, some sort of figure or symbols of liminality showing up, marking the fact that we are at a crossroads, that we have a decision to make, that we have multiple paths opening up before us. And we likely will have multiple paths or multiple choices to choose from, or just multiple projects, multiple energies, multiple people, things coming at us from different directions that we have to multitask and handle all at once. This is typical for mutable signs. It signifies at least, two or three things likely going on that are very significant at the same time, which kind of prevents us from completely focusing in on one thing and one thing only and bringing that to completion. It's going to be a process you need to open up to in terms of working on one thing and then moving on to the other thing and then coming back to that other thing. And you will end up getting the things done. But keep in mind that you will have to shift between what needs your attention. And when you focus in on something, just make sure that you do then focus in on it. Now, with this mutable T square, the thing that is so significant about it, as I mentioned before, is that Jupiter and Saturn are forming a waxing square aspect. This is the largest cycle of all four planets involved in this configuration. It's a 20-year cycle. And as I mentioned before, it's even more significant because this 20-year cycle that we're in with Jupiter and Saturn is really initiating us into a much longer age of air. So there is something incredibly significant that's very foundational about what Saturn in Pisces and what Jupiter and Gemini are indicating for you and where that's showing up in your chart. And so that Jupiter Saturn conjunction again goes back to that conjunction we had at the very end of 2020 at the first degree of Aquarius, right where Pluto is right now. So there's a fascinating aspect of this, that this cycle that we're really, there's so much about what's going on in the world right now is about this Jupiter and Saturn cycle, and that it happened in Aquarius. And now Pluto is there now. And now we're having a full moon in Aquarius, illuminating this place in all of our charts. If you think about that waxing square aspect formed by Jupiter and Saturn right now, it's very much like a first quarter waxing phase of the moon, except that instead of, like a month of time, this is a much larger 20-year cycle of time that we're at this opening square aspect. So if we think about, the last time we had one of these conjunctions, if you remember back in May of 2000, there was a Jupiter and Saturn conjunction in Taurus, and they came into their first waxing square in 2005. So if you can remember back in 2000, you might have had very significant things starting around then, things ending around then. What was starting around then that then led to a very critical phase of development in 2005? It's the exact same phase that we're in here. But if you just think about, your own story back in 2000 and what grew and developed and what you really had to take more responsibility for, what you had to put more effort into laying a more solid foundation for with whatever stage of growth you reached in 2005, that's the same type of phasal aspect that's going on right now with the Jupiter and Saturn cycle. And so, in addition to Jupiter and Saturn, as I mentioned, there's also a Mars and Venus square aspect happening at the same time, intersecting with this cycle. And so, that Mars and Venus cycle that's also reaching a first quarter waxing square right now also goes back to a conjunction that happened in Aquarius. But instead of happening back in 2020, this just happened earlier in the year, around February 22nd of 2024 at 7 degrees of Aquarius. Now, Pluto was also in Aquarius at this time. And so once again, fascinating link that where this cycle began in Aquarius, now the full moon is illuminating that in the same sign. Now, though the Mars and Venus cycle can relate to many things in world events and collective events, one way that I really like to work with it on personal levels is thinking about Mars and Venus as being incredibly personal planets of desire. Venus being desire in terms of what we're really attracted to, what we want to receive in our life, what we want to create, what kind of value system is sort of underpinning our style of creation, maybe whatever types of aesthetics or style we use, all forms of pleasure in our life, what we find pleasurable. But I think most of all, what do we really want to attract? What do we really want to magnetize? What kind of relationships do we want? How do we really want to creatively express ourselves? All of these things we can connect to Venus. Now, Mars, in some ways, has some overlap in terms of Mars can, in fact, be a very creative planet. And it can also be a planet of desire. But Mars is much more about what we really want to go after with a lot of drive, a lot of force, a lot of willpower. It can be very much the things we care so much about and are so passionate about that we want to fight for them. It's also perhaps most of all a planet of protection. So it can also very much be areas of life where we need to protect something. Now, Mars, of course, also can have a lot to do with strife and with violence. And certainly in world events, we can see that playing out right now. And that will be intensifying in the various concerning situations that are going on in the world right now in terms of war and violence as we come through this full moon. But on our personal lives, this Mars and Venus cycle can be very much about our own creative process as well as our relationship desires and relationship patterns. And so, what's really fascinating is that these areas of personal relationships, personal creation, is intersecting exactly with this much larger Jupiter Saturn cycle, which is connecting to much larger patterns that are playing out in world events and also much larger patterns of our own story of on a larger, Jupiter and Saturn are much more about this sort of greater work that our life is really invested in building. Whereas that Mars and Venus cycle can still very much go with, creations of great work, but it's a cycle that operates on a much smaller scale of time and tends to be more about, our shifting desires and values and that sort of thing that we deal with on smaller scales of time. And so on August 19th, at the same time as this Aquarius full moon, Jupiter and Saturn will form this waxing square aspect. The square aspect brings a lot of tension into the cycle, but it's also, again, this critical phase of growth that can be very dynamic. And so important patterns of growth will be happening right now, and you can actually make very substantial gains, very substantial progress with things. But keep in mind that, whereas Jupiter tends to expand things, grow things, Jupiter's always operating within that structure and skeletal system of Saturn. And so when they come to this waxing square aspect, whatever kind of growth is an expansiveness Jupiter is wanting to bring into your life has to meet the constraints, the limits, that force of necessity that Saturn is bringing to the situation. And so instead of this being like unbounded growth, it's some sort of intensification of whatever has been going on and whatever we've been building across these years. There may be some type of shedding we need to do, even letting go, emptying in some way. It's not all going to be about new things coming in. But keep in mind that it is at the same time because although this square does indicate some areas of our life, we need to change the way we're doing things, let go of certain things, shed certain things, reprioritize, especially with the Mercury retrograde happening at the same time. On this bigger scale of time, there is something really important coming in here with new levels of growth and personal development. And keep in mind that this is only the first of three exact square aspects. So it will be forming between Jupiter and Saturn. We're going to have another square at the end of this year on December 24th. And then we will eventually have the third and final one on June 15th of next year. So this is really an extended process. But the more you can become clear right now, and the more you can really focus in on what you really want to create and work on with your life and more fully commit to that and more fully take accountability and responsibility for that, the better you're going to continue to move through these changes that are coming through in not only the rest of this year, but again, the years ahead are going to bring extraordinary change. And so this is really a critical turning point into these accelerated changes that will be happening. Now, the final square in this three-part sequence does deserve a little bit of extra attention. This will be happening next year in the middle of June. And you can see when this happens, Saturn will be in Aries as with Neptune, um, getting very close to a conjunction with Neptune that will not completely come into exactness until the following year. But although this square right now is happening in Pisces and Gemini, it's going to end up falling into Aries and Cancer by the time we're done with this. And you can also see from this chart that Uranus is coming to that final degree of Taurus. And in fact, in less than a month from this final square, in that first week of July, Uranus will go into Gemini, being that final piece of activating all the planets, changing, not just changing signs, all changing from nocturnal, earth and water, slowing moving signs into them all occupying fire or air signs, which are much more fast moving. And it's going to go with things really moving much faster with the change than is going on now, which is another reason why the more you can, focus in on that right now and start making the changes and start laying the foundations, the better you're going to be able to move through this in ways that won't be as difficult as if you really resist making the changes that you need to make right now. Now, what can help with those changes is the Mercury retrograde, especially this inferior conjunction of Mercury that takes place on August 18th. This is always an incredibly powerful moment for reflection, for seeding new ideas. It's the time when Mercury is reanimated and regenerated, and a new cycle of Mercury is being seeded, which will eventually emerge by the end of August as Mercury emerges again as a morning star. Now, this conjunction occurring on August 18th at 27 degrees of Leo is, of course, that moment when Mercury is retrograde in between the Earth and the Sun. So this is when Mercury is retrograde, it's moving as close to us as it ever gets within its orbit. And so this is an incredibly powerful moment of liminality and reseeding. And just on this image, as we see a cocoon or a chrysalis, which is going to ultimately give birth to this butterfly and new growth and new embodiment on the other side once Mercury stations direct and is moving forward again. Right now, as we're heading into this full moon and as this full moon is forming, we are in this process of deep change. And especially this week building up to the full moon, as Mercury is getting closer and closer and closer to the sun, it's extremely powerful for changing things, for purifying things, for burning off the past, letting go of the past, changing habits, changing routines, anything like that you can do, any places you've been stuck. This is a time to really jump on activating that change. It's an extremely liminal period of time that will really assist that. And when we look at, the cycle of Mercury, a lot of times people talk about, the retrograde shadow zone of Mercury. And the important thing to realize about that is that doesn't have anything to do with the Mercury cycle. It's not anything about Mercury's phases. All that means is the shadow zone just means it's these degree ranges that Mercury will pass through multiple times. And so, that can be significant. But the part of Mercury's phase that actually is part of its phase and actually is important are the way the maximum elongations of Mercury when Mercury slows down right before its retrograde, as well as when Mercury speeds up after stationing direct. These occur around the same degree as the inferior conjunction, which in this case is all happening about 26 to 27 degrees of Leo. So if you think back to that past full moon in Capricorn, when that happened back around July 21st, Mercury was reaching its maximum elongation as an evening star, starting to slow down in order to station retrograde. Back on August 4th, Mercury did station retrograde. And so since then, we are getting drawn within. We can still get things done when Mercury is retrograde, and it can be very powerful for research and writing. But like I said, getting into a process of burning things off, changing habits and patterns, opening to this more liminality, opening more to what needs to be let go, what needs to be changed. That's really the most powerful ways to work with the Mercury retrograde period. And you can actually make real progress on goals and areas of your life you're focusing on during this time. But the fact that Mercury is being reseated here right at the same time of the full moon is incredibly powerful. And it really amplifies the potential of this full moon to deeply illuminate these much larger patterns of our life and storylines, much on a much bigger scale than we would normally have at one of these Mercury inferior conjunctions, just because it's all lining up at the exact same time. And the thing that I think is really especially beautiful about this particular one is the fact that the asteroid Vesta will be in Leo and forming a conjunction with Mercury and the Sun at the same time. Now, Vesta is an asteroid goddess that is very much connected to the Greek goddess Hestia. And even though there is a Hestia asteroid, I really like thinking about the goddess Hestia, especially in connection with the meaning of the asteroid Vesta. And so Vesta or Hestia is the goddess of the hearth, that goddess of that sacred flame. Hestia was such an important goddess, so central that it's almost because she was so central, we don't have actually that as many, depictions of her. We don't have lots of statues and paintings of Hestia because she was really embodied by that hearth, the hearth of the home, that central fire that coheres the family unit or whatever type of personal community you're part of. So it's that hearth in the middle of the home, but also that hearth that can cohere an entire community together. So this could be local community, the local people around you, local friends that you're in community with. But remember, Hestia and Vesta, they pull everybody together. So it's really this fire and hearth that can cohere an entire community of people. And this also could get applied to relationships, especially with the internet now and the way that we can have all these important alliances and larger communities of people all around the world. We can also see Hestia or Vesta signifying this. But I think most of all, what's most important about this is that idea of the devotional aspect of Vesta, tending that fire and that coherence of that hearth and that flame. And so we can really think about our own inner flame, our own inner hearth and heart as Mercury is in the heart of the sun at the same time. This really, again, amplifies the significance of this moment, cohering, focusing in on, what do you truly want to invest in? What do you truly want to devote yourself to? And really making a commitment to step more fully into whatever that is. And so, what I'm going to do now is just run through the 12 zodiac signs. And so, as I go through each sign, this will be most relevant if you are the rising sign of whatever sign I'm talking about. But it could also be relevant for your sun or moon sign, especially, as well as your lot of fortune. And so if you are Aries rising, Aries sun, Aries moon, or Aries lot of fortune, but especially the Aries rising people. And so one thing about Aries is, this is not an eclipse, but that you've been having eclipses happening in your first house. And so Aries is the host of that extremely powerful total solar eclipse that happened back in April. So likely whatever happened for you back in April, back in May, there's been some kind of major change with just who you are that's been going on for you. And after this full moon, in the months ahead, we're going to have another solar eclipse coming in Libra. And so you've been having eclipses happening in your first house, your Aries house, just about who you are. You've also been having eclipses happening in your seventh house, impacting your relationships. That the fact that we're dealing so much with who you are in your relationships makes us very powerful in terms of the Mars Venus cycle overlaying this mutable T square. That being said, the actual mutable T square is all happening in cadent houses for you. So Saturn has been really making those long-term, bigger picture foundational shifts and changes for you in the 12th house, whereas Jupiter has been moving through your third house. And so that Mars Jupiter conjunction, which can be extremely dynamic, extremely motivating, very visionary, really can be an aspect that makes you want to kind of conquer the world and overcome whatever kind of difficulties you're facing. It's really a beautiful combination for Aries people. It's having some kind of major tension for you, though, with whatever the Saturn story that's been playing out in your 12th house. And one thing that's, I think, very fascinating about the liminality and in betweenness of this mutable T square happening in cadent houses for you is that we know by the time we're done with these square aspects between Jupiter and Saturn, Saturn will be in your first house. And there is something extremely profound that is going to happen for you related to Saturn and Neptune ultimately coming together in your sign of Aries. And so, whatever is going on right now, just keep in mind this is a very extremely deep process of much larger changes. And so, just be flexible. If you're dealing with a lot of frustrations right now, just find a way to get through it. This could be very much a time, your tendency maybe to just spontaneously react and take a lot of initiative, you know, that may be very warranted in certain situations you're dealing with right now. But keep in mind that whatever these deeper Saturn lessons are that's going on for you right now, just be aware of how much energy and how much control you really have in certain situations. Now, the full moon is happening in your fifth house and your 11th house. And so, a lot of times people talk about Aries being just these people that are all about themselves and whatever they want to do. And certainly there's some truth with that incredible self-assertion that Aries people have. But Aries people can be in community and can have friends and can actually be incredibly dynamic contributors and participants in community and within alliances. We all want Aries people on our side. And there's something very important about these 11th house communities, larger associations of people, as well as just that very basic meaning of aspiration and hope being associated with Aquarius. And so something is really being illuminated here for you on this much bigger picture. All of these big changes you've been going through, like let yourself open up to that larger, bigger picture. And the Mercury Sun conjunction that's happening, that's reanimating something, purging something. This is happening in an incredibly creative and passionate sector of your chart. And so there might be something about your creative process that needs to be changed. There might be something about your relational desires and passions and pursuits of pleasure that is also undergoing some important change here. So just be really curious about whatever that is. Okay, so Taurus, the sign of the bull. Now, even though I'm not really focusing in too much here on Uranus, and I haven't actually been talking about it very much, one of the crucial aspects of this full moon and this conjunction of the sun with Mercury is the fact that it is forming a square aspect with Uranus. Now, you've had Uranus and Taurus, your sign, ever since 2018. So, I mean, there's this extraordinary change that you've been going through. But there's another layer and deepening of it that is really getting activated here with this full moon. And it's very much pinpointed on your career vocation. What are these larger patterns of change operating, these much larger goals that you have? There's something that Saturn in Pisces has been really calling you to take more authority for, lay a really solid foundation with your part in community, your part in these larger goals you have, things that you really care about, things you really want to contribute to the world. How can you join up in community? How can you take more leadership? But in some cases, you might need to compromise as part of alliances and part of different coalitions or groups that you're in. Now, the Mars Jupiter piece is in this extremely financial place for you. And so, with Mars there, just watch any kind of tendency to burn up resources needlessly or take too much of risk. But when we look at this configuration, how your 10th house is getting activated, the Mercury Sun is down in that fourth house, which can relate to your home, your ancestors, as well as deeper unconscious patterns. That Venus in Virgo is over there in that fifth house. The way you earn money, the way that you make your livelihood, something very profound here to step more fully into really completely aligning your life in the most authentic way. If you're in a situation where you've been working a job that you just really don't like and it's just burning you out and you're just doing it to pay the bills, it's of course extremely understandable given the state of the economy. And I'm not saying just to quit your job right now, but it's a really good time if you are in any kind of situation like that to really put in a lot of focus in on either looking for another job or figuring out how to start building your skills to transition to something that's going to, be more meaningful for you. Gemini. So Gemini being a mutable sign, this mutable T square is really hitting your chart full on. And it's actually an incredibly exciting and dynamic time for you as long as that Saturn transit through your 10th house is not weighing you down too much. And so I think the way this configuration for you, Gemini, is playing out has a lot to do with your relationship with this Saturn in Pisces transit. Saturn moving across your 10th house with Neptune there. There is great responsibility, greater authority, something very important about your vocation and career for you to be really developing, taking greater mastery over, laying a much more clear foundation for. And Jupiter and Mars are really asking you to take some risks, to really stretch things, to really act on a bolder vision. Now, whatever it is that you really want to be creating or doing, or changing about yourself is going to be facing those limits of Saturn up in your 10th house. It's one of those situations where, you can't be too Gemini and get too many things going where, you actually can't get anything done. So there's a way where whatever kind of bold, visionary, excitement and passion you have about really doing things in an exciting new way, think about how can that be done in a way that matches the actual amount of time and space and resources you have available for you. But the way this is impacting your 10th house and first house with the Jupiter Saturn cycle is honestly very exciting. It suggests you have a really important role in some way to step into with all the changes that are going on right now. Now, Venus is down in your fourth house. This could be importance coming in here about either your home or family, but this more interior place. If you've been drained by your job or you're really wanting to build things and get things going, but you're not making any time for yourself, that Venus transit down there through your fourth house, I think, is really calling you within, especially with this Mercury retrograde happening at the same time, or ways just to kind of deal with whatever kind of stress might be coming out through that, that weight of that Saturn in Pisces transit. The full moon is in your third house and your ninth house. These are cadent houses, but they're very, mystical houses, divinatory houses. Those of you that are involved in astrology or any work with astrology or any other divinatory system or higher learning or foreign travel, all those great ninth house themes, there's something big about that ninth house for you that's being opened up. And, this could involve in the bigger picture when we also bring in the mutable T-square, something about becoming more of a teacher, or if you're more of a writer in that kind of a Gemini way, that Sun Mercury conjunction happening is also really putting a lot of focus in on your communication style, your writing style, or perhaps it's something you do on social media or using the internet. But this can also be very mystical and, your own relationship with spirit, gods, goddesses, spirits, divination, ritual. That third, ninth house part being illuminated for you, that could be a place to go to even kind of deal with some of the big weight and pressure that's really impacting you by that mutable T-square falling in onto your angular houses. Cancer. Cancer, being a cardinal sign, is another one like Aries that has the mutable T square falling in the cadent houses of the 12th with Mars and Jupiter, Saturn up in that ninth house, and Venus down in the third house. And so the full moon in Aquarius, that's also forming the T square with Uranus and Mercury. That's happening in the succedent houses, which are a little bit more impactful for you, especially in terms of like finances, resources with other people. This big activation of whatever Uranus and Taurus story has been playing out for you these past years related to 11th house and community and associations. Like Aries, the thing that's really been hitting the angular houses for you has been the eclipses, with the solar eclipses up in your 10th house for Aries and the Libra eclipses down in your fourth house. And so there are another round of eclipses coming up, including a solar eclipse in Libra. And like I mentioned with Aries, another piece of this is the fact that although Saturn's in Pisces right now, once by the time we're done with these Jupiter Saturn squares next June, Saturn will be in Aries in your 10th house. So, whatever liminality and deep change is going on for you with Saturn in the ninth, Jupiter in the 12th, this is going to lead into much bigger, substantial, foundational changes with who you are and what you do in the world next year when Jupiter goes into Cancer and Saturn goes into Aries. With Saturn up there in the ninth, this again could involve some type of foreign travel or exploration for you. If you're in astrology, it's probably some sort of much deeper authority or systemization or greater maturity, very significant foundational work that you're doing in that ninth house way, or perhaps you're in academia or any of those ninth house topics. And one way or another, there's something very substantial that's coming in there for you, even if it feels weighty and heavy with that Saturn gravitas. Sun, Mercury in the second, and the full moon in Aquarius in the eighth. So there is something here then also very much about a financial piece. With the Mercury retrograde in the second, this could involve, some aspect of financial habits and investments to be looking into and looking at. But it also indicates that combined with the Aquarius activation, something about earning a livelihood and earning money, but the way this intersects with collaborations with either other people or other income streams. Perhaps you're somebody that's even, involved with like getting grants or fellowships or scholarships. And with that Uranus also in the 11th house, there's some sort of resourcing here, changes coming in with the way you make money that are not only just involving yourself, but there's something significant about that eighth house of other people. And, we can also say there's something even, on a deeper kind of psyche level, even kind of unconscious, subconscious level, probably something very profound going on for you in this time with that full moon illuminating that dark material of the eighth house, as well as the upcoming solar eclipse happening down in that fourth house for you. So, Leo, the Lions have a very exciting full moon here because the Sun Mercury is in your first house, really calling you to look at yourself and think about what kind of sense of renewal and regeneration and reanimation of that Leo image you have in the world. What needs to change here? And is there a new way to present yourself in the world? But at the same time, relationships are getting very much dramatically illuminated for you here. So this could involve romantic relationships or new friendships, but this also involves all types of business relationships, all types of contracts, something very significant happening for you here. And then with the Jupiter Mars in Gemini in your 11th house, this also has something to do with relationships and collaborations and something very exciting there, but in a way that Mars can bring in some volatility and strife. And then we have Saturn in your eighth house, which can also involve other people and like resources. Something's being illuminated with relationships, but at the same time, if you're involved, business with other people or investments in some way, there needs to be taken responsibility for. And with Neptune there, at times as that Saturn Neptune's coming together in your eighth house, that could get a little bit murky and unclear at times. So I think there's something about however that eighth house relates to other people's resources and whatever it is that you're doing, just to make sure you're staying very grounded and responsible and clear about whatever that is. And that way, that Venus in the second house, perhaps in the way that Venus opposing Saturn, we can see how this very much can relate to sort of that force of Eros and pleasurable Venus running into like tension with that serious gravity and constraints of Saturn. In some situations, if you're not paying attention to that, there's going to be some sort of pressure on you related to your own resources. And so I think there's just importance about being discerning and discriminating and being careful and analytical with that Venus placement. Otherwise, with the way the full moon is forming this square aspect with Uranus, there's been something exciting or volatile, extremely dynamic related to you and Uranus and your work in the world in these years of Uranus being in Taurus. And so with the Mercury Sun forming that square to Uranus here, I think there's a real deepening about making those Uranian changes, which sometimes those Uranian changes they seem outlandish or just kind of shocking or ungrounded in some way. It's really making them grounded. How do you integrate this into who you are? Hopefully that can also play into making that Mars, Jupiter, and Gemini in your 11th house, very inspiring in terms of as you're changing how you are, you start connecting to more and more people that really resonate with that core of who you are. And those inner shifts that you're going through will then be reflected with, the changes within those 11th house associations and groups that you're part of. All right, so Virgo. Virgo is another of the mutable signs, and so another one of the signs that is getting the full force of this mutable T square hitting your chart in the angles. Now, for you, that weight and serious long-term consequences of Saturn are happening in your relationship house. So this again could be just one-on-one relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, but it's really all relationships, any business partnerships, any type of contractual relationship. But Saturn in the seventh, also keep in mind when Saturn goes into your seventh house, it's gone through this long, 14 or so year journey of moving from your first house all the way down the bottom of your chart. And now it's come up into an angular house to start heading up towards your 10th house in the next 7 years. And so this can usually bring a very significant turning point when Saturn's in your seventh house about you stepping more into your work in the world in some kind of really significant way. And we really see this here with Jupiter and Gemini forming that square aspect in your 10th house with Mars there. Something very dynamic here to kind of push through with. But, there might be some pretty big tension in terms of, whatever you're being really called to do. You're going to have to keep a track of, when is it too much? When do you need to pull back and find more rest or not push so hard with your work? Or, this Mars Jupiter conjunction in your 10th could also just signify some temporary frustrations and issues you just got to kind of deal with whatever you're trying to do out in the world. And then with Venus in your first house, this is an opportunity, even though Venus is involved in, squares with Mars, square with Jupiter, opposition with Saturn, it's still Venus. And it's still Venus in your first house. And so, you know, it might feel, rough with relationships during this time, and for some of you. But, you know, Venus in your first house still can bring, some sweetness into your life. And, just look for that sweetness where you can find it with Venus and Virgo. And think about, what you really want in your relationships. And think about, what is this dynamic vision of your career and vocation that you're really feeling with that Mars and Jupiter in your 10th house. And see how, that Venus transit in Virgo through your first house can help you kind of recalibrate, who you are in the world and how you're showing up right now, to be more aligned with that. Now, the full moon combined with Uranus, that T square is happening in cadent houses for you. And so this full moon could very much be illuminating some health concerns. And I think especially, the state of the world is concerning for all of us. Um, where the way this full moon is hitting your chart in the 12th and the 6th, um, Virgo being such a caring sign that can tend towards melancholy at times, being that earth quality with the rising. Um, just the state of the world right now, I feel like that full moon in your 12th and 6th could bring on some just mental anxiety and that sort of thing. So just think about what types of health routines, just daily preventative measures, whether that's just taking rest or doing some meditation or, journaling or, just taking a walk or exercise, but literally even just taking a walk, moving, any kind of movement. There's something with that Sun Mercury conjunction in your 12th house. There's something really deep there, being renewed and being reseated. And there's obviously been something extremely exciting about this Uranus and Taurus through your ninth house transit that this full moon is also setting off. If there's something coming through that's a little more difficult or anxiety provoking with this full moon, again, I would just really just take measures to focus in on things that, if it's just drinking some tea, calming your nerves down. There's that mutable T square is really indicating really significant work for you to be doing and accomplishing. You might be somebody that already knows what that is and you're already embarking on that. And if you haven't felt like you fully stepped into that yet, keep in mind that this mutable T square is playing out for the rest of the year. We're going to have another one at the end of this year. So you don't have to have everything figured out here, but just figure out, what's a few steps you can start taking towards that more empowering vocational direction with your life. Sometimes with Virgo, people talk about, not making sure everything's perfect all the time. And that's certainly something for you to keep in mind here. It's really just taking a step forward here. Things are going to be really messy and chaotic for all of us. Libra. So Libra being a cardinal sign is another one that has this mutable T square falling in your cadent houses. And like I've mentioned with the other cardinal signs, the thing that's been very angular for you has been these eclipses. And so we will have another eclipse in October that will come into your first house and be very significant. But where all the action is happening right now, full moon is really impacting something very creative for you. This is a great full moon to really open up to thinking about pleasure and creativity, the eros and greater erotic creative eros that you would really like to experience with your work. Now, within that, and whatever is being illuminated for you regarding that, the Mercury retrograde is really calling you to look at some of those hopes and aspirations you have, make them more aligned with what's going to really be, more deeply meaningful for you. That Mars and Jupiter conjunction in the ninth house can also be really helpful for you in terms of that, helping you kind of spark what's that kind of bigger picture. That Mercury retrograde kind of help you course correct in a way, however that needs to be adjusted. But there could be a really powerful sense of renewal and regeneration in terms of the groups and associations that you're part of here. With Saturn in the sixth, this has been a long-term transit that you're in. Again, this could definitely indicate in a different way from when I was talking about Virgo. I would also bring up again here the idea of like preventative health measures and really looking at all the types of daily routines that you have going on in your life and using the Mercury retrograde as part of that too to help you continue to adjust with whatever that Saturn and Pisces transit has been calling your attention to. As Saturn, by the time we get to the end of this Jupiter Saturn sequence, Jupiter will be in Cancer up in your 10th house, and Saturn will be in Aries in your 7th house. And so the changes that you're going through right now, they're going to end up having a really big impact for you by this time next year. Things will be very, very different. And so this is a really powerful time of being kind of in between, in transition. And just kind of keep that in mind. There's something much bigger coming for you down the road. Scorpio. So, Scorpio, the most angular thing for you with this whole configuration is that full moon in Aquarius. You've had the Uranus and Taurus transit in your 7th house of relationships for a long time now. And this full moon with the Mercury sun is really bringing your attention to vocation, career, what you do in the world, how you're seen in the world. And the full moon down in the fourth is definitely bringing up some tension, perhaps between home and that more, interior place. Perhaps it also involves unconscious patterns, could involve some ancestral patterns, ancestral issues with your parents and how that relates to whatever's been going on for you. It's just definitely indicating though in a very important time for you with your work in the world. And Saturn in your 5th house is definitely a major call to get very serious about your creativity and whatever it is you really want to create, what you're really passionate about. Also, whatever is going to bring you pleasure. The Venus transit through your 11th is definitely impacting something in terms of friendships. And so while we normally would maybe think about the Venus moving through your 11th being helpful for friendships, could be some different tensions, different issues that have been going on within friendships. And this may not actually even have anything to do with you. It could, but it could be just you have friends that are caught up in a bunch of drama with their friends and, they're talking to you about it and so forth. That's definitely one way that this could be playing out for you. But with the combination of the full moon in the fourth and that Mars and Jupiter in your eighth, it does make me think too about just some of your own deeper unconscious patterns getting illuminated and activated with this full moon and just being kind of gentle on yourself and feeling into, whatever that might be for you, depending upon your situation. But I really love the Mercury Sun conjunction for you in the 10th. And in the ways that, Scorpio, you are a fixed sign, and all the fixed signs can be a little stubborn sometimes about change, but you definitely have that great capacity for transformation, metamorphosis, letting go of things. And so there is something being shed here and regenerated, burned off, and but also renewed. Something exciting about your work in the world to really step into here. Pay attention to that as that Mercury Sun comes together and the full moon illuminates it. All right, Sagittarius, the other mutable sign that is not involved in this mutable T square. So one thing about all the other mutable signs is all the other mutable signs have one of the corners of this mutable T square in their first house. Sagittarius is the one mutable sign that is not really being activated by any planetary transits right now. So this could be the kind of thing where you're really impacted by this mutable T square, but compared to the rest of the mutable signs, it may not be quite as, front and center with something going on within you. But we can definitely see how it certainly involves your career and work and involves stuff with your home or ancestors, parents, involves your relationships. There's some kind of dynamic change, new developments with relationships, with business partnerships, with contracts, something dynamic coming in there with that Mars and Jupiter. But the Saturn down there in your fourth within this dynamic is really looking to build something really solid, foundational for you, a really solid base that you can really build your life off of in the years ahead. And that could be something about a home or a family, some kind of interior place that you're being pulled into. And so, whatever process you've been involved in there, there's then at the same time something with Venus moving through your 10th that is you've been really pulled way down into that fourth house realm with the Saturn transit. And so Venus is catalyzing something for you up in that 10th house. And so just pay attention to whatever that is, because that Venus transit through Virgo is setting off everything else with the longer term Jupiter and Saturn transit you're going through. Just be really curious about what that is in that Sagittarius kind of way that you have about getting excited, really getting inspired to go after something. See, be curious about whatever that is that Venus is sparking for you. Like Gemini, the full moon is happening in the ninth and the third. So again, ritual, spirit work, magic, any kind of divinatory systems, these could all be really important for you. Certain tools that you might be able to use to kind of navigate, as well as just significant development that you're going through right now in any kind of magical or ritualistic practice that you have. Certainly, with the full moon in the third, though, this could be very much about writing, about your use of social media, communication. Something really profound and important is going on for you in these years with all that Aquarius. And so something will be really illuminated for you about that here. And the Mercury Sun up in the ninth, for those of you that do astrology or are involved in academia, if your work is very much tied into the ninth house in some way, whether that's teaching or speaking, a lot of times Sagittarius people do have something significant related to themselves and those ninth house topics. I mean, be curious again about, what is being renewed there, what's being reanimated there. Capricorn being another cardinal sign, the last of the cardinal signs that we have covered. You, like the other cardinal signs, have this mutable T-square happening in your cadent houses. And so, in that way, the mutable T-square is not as kind of front and center in your life, but this could be opening up really important, significant change for you nonetheless, especially with that Mars and Jupiter in your sixth house, and the fact that you've been having eclipses happening in your 10th house of Libra, your fourth house of Aries. It makes me think very much about, again, like I've mentioned with some of the other signs, some of those preventative health measures. Being a Capricorn, where are you have you been working yourself too hard? And where do you need to take a break? Where do you need to put in some new practices, whether that's just rest or relaxation techniques or exercise or diet, something in that sixth house realm, changing up some routines. The Saturn in your third house, though, long term wise, there's something very important about your role, either in your local community, or perhaps if you're someone that has a business or some important work you do using the internet or social media. There's something about your role with that in that whatever community you're part of in that way that Saturn has really been drawing your attention to. And it's a time to get taking more authority, getting more serious about your communication style, perhaps about writing or some other type of communication. Third house use of the mind coming in there. And then with the full moon in the second and the sun, Mercury in the eighth, and it's forming the T square with Uranus in your fifth, that Uranus in the fifth transit you've had has really had the potential to open up vast vast levels of new, exciting sources of creativity and passion with your work. And so, what I'd really be hoping with this full moon is that this is really illuminating something, very resourcing for you about whatever that's been. It could very much just be a financial boon. You just receive financial rewards or new opportunities to make money through whatever that is. But keep in mind with the Sun, Mercury in the eighth house and that being renewed, there might be something about your role in collaborating with other people or your partner's resources, something there that just needs to be a little bit adjusted. But also, it being the reanimation here, some kind of exciting new development. Something's being regenerated, being reanimated there in a maybe a collaborative way, or that could be getting like a grant or a scholarship, something involving any kind of partner. Could be romantic partners resources or just like collaborations with other people and that sort of thing. Okay, so Aquarius. So, like Leo, who we did earlier, this full moon is really front and center for you. So, obviously, you are the sign that hosted the Jupiter and Saturn conjunction. You've got Pluto and Aquarius now. The Mars Venus conjunction was in your first house. This full moon is in your first house. So, just something very profound about who you are in the world in this very major way is being illuminated here. However you've been impacted by Pluto coming into your sign, by that Jupiter Saturn cycle being initiated in your sign, whatever process is underway for you, that's really the main takeaway for this full moon for you. But in that relationship piece, something is being reanimated and regenerated there. So that could either be new relationships coming in or the ability to create some kind of new dynamic with existing relationships, new partnerships, new collaborative opportunities. Venus being in your eighth house, also really calling attention to that idea of collaboration and resourcing with other people. But, then there's also your own financial situation, your own resources related to that Saturn in Pisces transit through your second house. This could also very much relate to really important long-term investments that you're doing, financial planning you're doing, just the work you're putting in to really lay down a more secure financial situation for yourself. But if you can bring all of this together, this is very exciting because this could be very substantive growth and development in a creative realm that is, in fact, really solidly building your own financial resources at the same time. Okay, so the final sign, Pisces. Pisces, you've been dealing with Saturn, you've been dealing with Neptune for even longer. And there's so much more of the story of Saturn and Neptune to come in the next year as they get closer and closer together in your sign. Pisces, you're being asked to step up, take more responsibility, claim more authority, get grounded, step into some larger role of responsibility. But with that, that the tension of the Jupiter Mars coming in to your fourth house there, it's not up in your 10th house. Now, there still could be very much 10th house things happening at this time because, Mars and Jupiter are opposite the 10th house, and Saturn and Venus are squaring your 10th house. So 10th house career stuff could be very big here. But something is really pulling you within or really pulling you in to really build that really secure foundation at home. Perhaps this could also be something related to your parents or issues with your parents, ancestral patterns, ancestral relationships also being really significant here. And then with Venus and Virgo in the seventh house, new opportunities in the relationship realm coming in here, but obviously there's then tension with whatever is going on with you and that Saturn, that weight of Saturn. So on one hand, you just have to make sure whatever Saturn kind of gravity and stress you might be dealing with isn't adversely affecting your relationships. But there's definitely a way to find a middle ground here. And in that way, the Venus transit through your seventh could actually be bringing some nice sweetness into relationships, making some time for something more pleasurable and fun there. Because, with Saturn in your first and Jupiter, Mars in your fourth, there could be a bit of like some kind of grind that you've been really going through at this time. Even though we might think, oh, that Venus is in really bad shape here in this transit. For you, just getting Venus over there in the seventh house could actually be experienced pretty positively, because it is Venus and it's Venus going through the seventh house. And so instead of just dealing with Saturn, you're getting some Venus coming in. Now, the full moon in your 6th and 12th, this definitely makes me think about, like I've talked about with some of the other signs, preventative health measures, especially the way it impacts your mental health, any anxieties you might be dealing with because of that Saturn transit. Saturn can really wear us down physically, that then completely drains us mentally. And so, what are just some really nice routines in that sixth house way with that Mercury retrograde there? Are you doing anything to excess with your diet or drink? Does there need to be more moderation or just more healthy routines brought in? At the same time, there's something very liminal here about this full moon. And so, being in the 12th, if you are able to get some time in solitude and get in your own space and just sort of meditate and really go deep with that Sun Mercury conjunction happening here, there could be something really profound that and really revelatory that's opened up for you in this more in between liminal place with that full moon in Aquarius. One of the things I would just focus on with this is just thinking about how can you, rebalance and temper whatever that Saturn transit has been throwing off by just becoming too heavy and serious. But at the same time, there's good reason for Saturn asking you to be serious. And there's something substantial that you really have the opportunity to be building and developing at this time. And so one thing I would also say with that Venus in your seventh, if you have reason to celebrate or just, look back at what you've accomplished so far with the Saturn transit, let yourself take that in and see that and feel that. But also just be aware, you've got more work to do with that Saturn transit, and it's not always easy when you're dealing with it. In fact, it is not easy when you're dealing with Saturn transiting your sign. But it's also true that by the end of that transit, you can have built something very beautiful and profound that's going to be a source of strength and security and stability for you in the years ahead. And so just keep that in mind with whatever you've been going through at this time.